So it's always unfortunate when we have a scratching from a form guide, and it's with his sincere apologies that Adjunct Professor Erik Eklund cannot make it this afternoon. In his place, Dr. Andrew Kilsby has kindly accepted to step up and deliver his presentation. So Andrew, thank you very much indeed.
What's that? I didn't catch that.
So I was just sure the bell worked in.
Oh, good, good. Keep it going. I don't know how everyone's feeling at the moment. Would you like to stand up and just have a stretch? Just a bit of a... I know I can. Yeah, Sunday afternoon, but you know, I'm the night watchman for the last session. Okay, that's enough. You've had it. Don't go walking away. Just sit down again. Thank you. Eric's wife is in hospital and he had to go quickly and hasn't come out of the hospital yet, so he does send his apologies. His presentation, The Cold War Strategic Realignments and Sovereignty, Case Study of the Acquisition of the Charles F. Adams class destroyers. In 1961, the Australian government announced the decision to acquire 2 Charles F. Adams class US-built destroyers. A third ship was added in 1963, then a fourth was proposed in 1964, but it wasn't supported by Cabinet. Subsequently, HMAS Perth, Hobart and Brisbane were commissioned between 1965 and 1967, and these ships brought new air defence and command and control capability to the RAN. These were ships of a different kind, bringing modern ship-to-air missile capability as well as increasingly sophisticated battlefield and computerised battlefield management systems. The senior officer recently commented that these ships took us to another level. The main difference between the Perth-class ships and other RAN ships at the time was that everything worked on the Perth-class when you turned it on. These were sophisticated ships of a new class, the Air Warfare Destroyer. The class had only tentatively emerged in the US Navy in modified form in the 1950s. 4 Forrest Sherman-class destroyers were converted to guided missile destroyers, or DDGs as naval people would know them as, in the late 1950s. The subsequent Charles F. Adams class, destroyer class, based on the Forrest Sherman design, was commissioned by the USN in 1960. This class was the first mature expression of a purpose-built and well-made missile carrier. The fact that Australia acquired this class of ship only a few years after the USN ship was commissioned, the first one, commissioned in 1960, makes this story all the more relevant and interesting, but more on that issue later. And this was the first time that Australia had acquired ships that were not British or British designed and built in Australia. Any consideration of the Perth-class ships needs to start with a PhD thesis, in this case by David Shackleton, a former Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral, and his focus was the internal impact on the RAN and across multiple areas of the RAN by this acquisition. He argued that Perth-class drove cultural change, better interoperability with the US, by the way, and paradoxically, a better, stronger and more independent RAN. To work with the USN as a new alliance partner, we first had to work out who we were and what we stood for. Shackleton takes this particular acquisition decision and dives into the heart of the 1960s RAN that was growing and changing at the time. But if we take the same point of departure and look externally to a wider context, then we can usefully identify other important insights. I'm going to suggest that the acquisition of US-built destroyers was a key moment in the development of the Australian-US alliance. Not a dramatic turning point, but the specifics of the acquisition are very revealing of the changing Cold War strategic context. This moment in time provides important insights into the Australian, but also the changing US and UK situations. I'm also going to say a few words about the role of overseas acquisition and its relationship to naval defence sovereignty. Of course, we have to understand exactly what is meant by the term sovereignty in the defence context, and I will return to this briefly at the end of the paper. Before looking at the Perth class, let's look back a little way to consider relevant historical context. The Second World War revealed the central importance of a domestic shipbuilding industry or capacity, as our sea lines of communication were interdicted by disguised German raiders, German submarines and Japanese submarines, even right around the top end of Australia. Shipbuilding was geared up in Newcastle, Brisbane and Whyalla. Anyone know where Whyalla is? Just kidding. Through a joint effort of government, navy and private enterprise. In the post-war period, as the crisis subsided, I haven't put the ED on the end of subsided, this impetus was lost and the RAN returned to acquiring its vessels from the Royal Navy and building vessels in Australia of RN design. In times of national crisis, with the Pacific War raging though, our capacity to gear up local production and repair was vital to our own survival, and that was like ingrained in the thinking coming out of World War II, powerfully shaped our subsequent understanding of sovereign capacity. So let's talk first of all about the UK strategic context. After 1945, as you know, the UK steadily withdrew from what they termed the Far East, but the change was a slow and uneven process that did not necessarily come easily. The UK had emerged from the war damaged and very heavily in debt, with her former colonies seeking independence. The Cold War refocused UK attention on Europe and NATO. They did retain a role in the BCOF in Japan, of course in Korea subsequently, and with the Far East Strategic Reserve in the Malaya context. But their standing and influence was diminishing. Poor old Royal Navy, they've been there for so long. A joint weapons program with Australia as a junior partner in atomic testing eventually wound down in 1959, as we've been hearing about. And spy scandals, thank you Reece, that's very revealing, has led to the US formally cutting access to atomic secrets after the passage of the McMahon Act in 1946. And the 1956 Suez Crisis undermined British confidence and encouraged a strategic refocus on Europe and the Mediterranean. Hello vampires, Malta. There was some residual resistance to any decision by Australia to buy US material. Guess from who? Senior RN officers and British shipbuilders. In the late 1950s, British policymakers were sensitive to the Australian assumption that it was the US and not the UK who would be the key alliance partner in the region. Likewise, the Australians did not necessarily abandon the tradition and heritage of the RN, of course, so change came slowly and at times with some difficulty. As they said it years ago in my past at the language school, make haste slowly. The US strategic context. The acquisition of the Charles F. Adams class destroyers also occurred at a strategically significant moment for the US. The US was being challenged globally by an increasingly confident and aggressive Soviet Union. In Europe, the Cold War curtain had come down, the Iron Curtain had come down well and truly, and you had NATO countries versus Warsaw Pact countries across that Iron Curtain. Further abroad, new challenges for the US lay in balancing competing commitments across multiple theatres. It's always a perennial challenge for global superpowers. In the Pacific, Communist China had occupied islands formerly claimed by the Chinese nationalists, as we heard earlier, Quemoy. And even closer to home, the US had to contend with the Cuban Missile Crisis of 61-62. In the mid to late 1950s, the Eisenhower administration had firmed up its policy on foreign aid and military assistance, as embodied in the so-called Eisenhower Doctrine. The US further clarified its approach to the Pacific and Southeast Asia, but still faced challenges in Congress, what a surprise, with foreign aid and military assistance appropriation. Sounds like yesterday. Congress was loath to approve any increase in the aid budget. In fact, over 1958-59, it went down by 10%. The stakes were also high for the US as the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations had to find an effective and sustainable way to support its allies around the world. So then we come to the Australian strategic context. In 1957, as we've heard, there was a clear statement by Prime Minister Menzies in Parliament that Australia was focusing on the US alliance. The joint Australian-UK atomic testing program was abandoned and intelligence sharing with the US resumed. Also, by the late 1950s, there was further clarification of the reduced role of the Royal Navy and the British east of Suez. And the 1959 Defence Review, was that the first one? I think we had, was that, do you remember yesterday someone said about the reviews? I think that was the first one in Australia. The 1959 Defence Review argued that Australia needed to act more independently, especially in light of the declining role for the UK and emerging challenges presented by, for example, Indonesia. In particular, acquisition of Soviet-built ships and missiles by Indonesia was a vital context for Australian moves to acquire new missile capability. And now we come down another level to the Navy context, our Navy's context. So as we look across the Royal Australian Navy in the late 1950s and early 1960s, this was also a very difficult time for Navy. John Gordon, Minister for the Navy between 1959 and 1963, was a very hands-on and energetic minister. Gordon found the Navy struggling with an ageing fleet and reduced budgets. Accidents and incidents also started to erode public confidence in the Navy. In October 1960, HMAS Woomera sunk off Sydney after an explosion and subsequent fire while dumping obsolete ammunition. 2 seamen lost their lives. In October 1962, 5 crew from the carrier HMAS Sydney drowned after a small boat accident. And then, of course, came the worst accident of all in 1964, the Voyager incident, when 82 lives were lost and 2 royal commissions followed, which challenged this public standing of Navy. On the bigger stage, the decision to withdraw fixed-wing aircraft, announced in 1959, was a blow to Navy prestige and firepower. In other words, there was a lot of pressure for the Perth-class acquisition to go well, and the stakes were very high. Could Navy afford another high-profile scandal or a poor outcome? Would the new Perth-class be an appropriate and worthy successor to HMAS Perth, which had been lost in battle in the Sunda Straits in 1942. So much rested, it seemed, on the success of the Perth-class acquisition. The acquisition decision was strongly prosecuted by politicians mindful of the need to take the US-Australian alliance to a more mature level, as outlined by Peter Dean today. On this occasion, RAN senior officers were somewhat ambivalent, uncertain whether to cut strong and enduring ties with the Royal Navy. Although highly regarded by senior Navy officers, as a former RAAF pilot, Gordon had been a Spitfire pilot, I think, in World War II, Gordon was far less exercised by any lingering Royal Navy loyalties. Gordon was concerned about the state of the Navy and was keen to pursue acquisitions that were of highest quality and strategic value. In the late 1950s, steps were taken to pursue a modified British design, county-class design destroyer, but the cost was prohibitive and the British were not amenable to modifying the destroyer, the design for Australian conditions. And further, the Australians had seen the British-designed Sea Slug missile on trials at Woomera, were not impressed. With a name like that, who'd be impressed? Sea Slug, good one. While there was a reluctance to finally part with the Royal Navy connection, we do know that Chief of Navy from 1948 to 1955, Vice Admiral John Collins, and his successors Vice Admiral Dowling and Vice Admiral Burrell, had recognised the desirability and perhaps inevitability of the RAN acquiring US-built ships. The capability was acquired at a timely moment. Pursuing a defence strategy of forward defence, Australia was engaged in the emerging crisis in Vietnam, but requests in 1962 by the government of Vietnam for two RAN ships was refused by the Defence Committee because of existing commitments to the Far East Strategic Reserve and a lack of suitable ships. By 1967, however, the government was able to offer and deploy a near new ship of HMAS Perth. And this was also, of course, more easily integrated into the US 7th Fleet, operating off Vietnam from its base in Manila, in the Philippines. Now, this is a really interesting paragraph, financial terms. The Royal Australian Navy acquired the Perth-class ships on very favourable terms. The initial payment for two DDGs was only $1.5 million. Yeah, I read it, I said, it must be 150 million, surely. No, 1.5 million, with the balance of 88.5, in other words, 90 million altogether, to be paid over 8 years, interest-free. Now, that's a deal. How many could we get done today for that money? Zero. Maybe a lifeboat. Likewise, the third DDG was acquired under the terms of the US Foreign Assistance Act with an interest-free loan facility of almost 38 million. Good deal. On first assessment, the acquisition of the Perth-class ships was a success for the RAN and for Australian defence capability more generally. We acquired modern, sophisticated missile-carrying ships within 5 years of that class being commissioned into the USN. The time from public announcement to commissioning of Perth, 4 years. How many could we get out of Australia today in 4 years? Purchase of a US-built ship had all kinds of benefits, from a relatively short acquisition timeframe, access to more sophisticated weaponry, and favourable, as we've heard, financial terms. The US Tartar missiles were believed to be superior to the British Sea Slug, and within 18 months, Perth was deployed into Vietnam. By the early 1970s, the three DDGs, along with 6 Oberon-class submarines, I know Tom Lewis will be talking about this in the next session, and 6 upgraded River-class frigates represented a highly capable fleet. RAN carrier capability had also returned, since changing policies over the aircraft carrier meant that HMAS Melbourne stayed on as a rotary platform, and later aircraft acquisitions, again from the US, reinstated the fixed-wing capability. Geoffrey Gray, the historian, accurately characterises the acquisition of the Charles F. Adams class as a gradual, sometimes painful, reorientation away from the Royal Navy and towards the United States Navy, but then suggests that the acquisition itself led to a cycle of boom and bust for the local shipbuilding industry. This claim is too strongly drawn. Instead, we saw US-designed ships complemented by Australian weaponry, including the anti-submarine Ikara missiles, and a significant amount of onshore upgrades required to house the crew. Governments were very sensitive to this question of the overseas spend, and $10 million, $9.5 million, or just under 20% of the total acquisition budget for the first two DDGs, there I go again, was spent in Australia on Australian weaponry, modifications and crew quarters. We also saw shipbuilding continuing for other classes of ships throughout the 1960s, for example, the River-class frigates being built at Cockatoo in Sydney and Williamstown here in Melbourne. There was indeed a decline in local shipbuilding in the 1970s, but it was not so much overseas acquisition that compromised local shipbuilding as it was the performance of the local shipyards in terms of delays and cost overruns for the River-class ships. The failed DDL destroyers, slated for the Williamstown dockyard in 1972 but cancelled the following year, only reinforced negative perceptions of local shipbuilders. So considered across a wider frame of reference, the Perth-class acquisition allowed us to take delivery of a class-leading ship in a short time frame, but did not halt local engagement or involvement or even local shipbuilding. There was a more nuanced and complicated set of possibilities for acquisition beyond choosing either continuous domestic shipbuilding and therefore maintaining defence sovereignty, or acquiring vessels from overseas shipyards and hence benefiting from quicker delivery times. I can feel my throat going. How can a middle power like Australia develop and sustain meaningful defence sovereignty given our reliance on our US partner and increasingly globalised supply chains? It's hardly a straightforward question. Many inside and outside of the ADF today have turned their minds to this problem as embodied in the current Defence Industrial Capability Plan and the related capability priorities. Middle power ambition comes with an assumed level of industrial capacity, but the Australian economy, as we've heard, is increasingly a service-orientated economy with a strong primary sector, but our industrial sector has been in decline since the late 1960s, a phenomenon of advanced economies throughout the Western world, while high-end technical and technological skills are in short supply and high demand. So the Cold War experience around these issues reveals the current day discussions of sovereign capacity in the context of a crucial alliance structure and a highly globalised supply chain. These are not new. The specifics are of course different, but the fact remains that between 1945 and 1967, Australian defence planners negotiated the fine line between sovereignty capacity and reliance on our allies very effectively. The changeover between an RAN that had essentially been an evolved branch of the Royal Navy towards an RAN that increasingly was integrated with the US Navy, both in operational and supply chain terms, was handled well, if not without the occasional misstep. As Shackleton argues, the transition from the the Royal Navy to the US Navy as the primary partner actually enabled a greater defence sovereignty and facilitated a cultural change in the RAN itself. So paradoxically, overseas acquisition did not compromise defence sovereignty so much as frame that capability in new and different ways. A lot of heavy lifting in this argument goes to the words sovereign and sovereignty. The standard argument is that shipbuilding capability coming out of our Second World War ingrained experience is the strongest feature of maritime defence sovereignty. Looked at another way though, in the early 1960s the Australian government identified the strategic benefits and the financial values inherent in acquiring the DDGs, I got it this time, from a US shipyard. While the politics of these acquisitions often turns on local jobs and the capacity of the local industry to sustain itself, there is no point being trapped by a false set of paired opposites, with apparently sovereign local shipbuilding on one side, or apparently quicker and better value overseas acquisitions on the other. Yet the 1961 government decision to purchase the Charles F. Adams destroyer class was in itself an act of sovereignty. A better platform, better missiles, and eventually better battle management. A reasoned choice that provided immediate strategic and financial benefits that helped secure a stronger Navy for Australia from the mid-1960s and beyond. As the first Sea Lord, Admiral Lord Fraser, wrote of the RAN rather presciently in 1951, once a move towards the US has been started, I should have put an accent there, shouldn't I? Once the move towards the US has been started, I feel it been very difficult to resist further diversions. Oh, very good. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Andrew for delivering Professor Eklund's presentation this afternoon. I think I'll let him off the hook and we won't ask for questions on this particular occasion. I'm sorry, William.
Could I make a comment?
Yes.
Based on an interview I had the privilege of having with Sir Henry Burrell, who was Chief of the Naval Staff from 1959 to 1962. there were two rivals, one of which was the DDG and the other that British thing, on the table for the modern destroyer replacement. And as part of Henry's Burrell's relationship with Gordon, which was very close but unusual, he went to the United Kingdom to look at their offerings. And he was privileged to be invited to speak to Mountbatten, who was then Chief of the Defence Force Staff. Burrell had been under Mountbatten's command during the Second World War in a small way and knew him. But that particular interview between the Chief of the Defence Force Staff and the Chief of the Australian Naval Staff took place in Mountbatten's office. Mountbatten didn't offer him a seat and harangued him for 40 minutes without allowing him particularly to interrupt or to offer his views, making the point that it was tantamount to, it was against the British way for the Australians to even consider the DDG. Burrell walked away from that discussion even more determined to go to the DDG. Sometimes a personal element plays a large part in defence procurement.
Indeed. In the back?
If I can add an anecdote to that. So I used to work with David and others with Admiral Chris Barry. And I spoke to Chris about this very issue. Chris was on exchange with the Royal Navy when the decision was made to go for the DDGs. And he said the British Royal Navy commander paraded all the Australians on base. He said there was about 30 or so of us. Held us at attention for a long time until he turned up and then proceeded to berate every Australian for the betrayal to the Empire, the Commonwealth, the British Navy, for the Royal Navy decision, and proceeded to basically treat them appallingly for the rest of the time. And then Admiral Barry said he was one of the first RAN officers to go and take carriage of the DDGs from the US. He said, and he'd been on exchange with the British Navy equivalent. He said it was a hunk of junk, and everything, as said in the paper, everything worked on the American ship. And it was just so much better. But he said it's the same thing. They got personally berated by the Royal Navy Admiral for the decision the Australian government took.
Thank you. All right, on that note, I think afternoon tea is served. Thank you.